Welcome back. Now that we understand a little bit more how collision works in Unreal Engine, it's time to talk about overlap events. Let's go back to our BP item and let's open up that blueprint. And we know about begin play and tick, but here's an event. Just here by default, it's grayed out, but it's called event actor begin overlap. Now, if we hover over it, it says that this is an event when this actor overlaps another actor, for example, a player walking into a trigger. It goes on to say that for events when objects have a blocking collision, for example, a player hitting a wall, see hit events. So we know that actors have overlap events and hit events. And the final note says components on both this and the other actor must have B generate overlap events set to true to generate overlap events. So our actor BP item has an item mesh. This is a static mesh component. And if we scroll down to collision, here's that generate overlap events boolean. It's B generate overlap events in C++, and we see that it's set to true by default here in the blueprint. Now we'd like to see how this event actor begin overlap works. And we see that it has this other actor as an input pin. Now this is here because actors already have this event built in by default. And we can use it to trigger something in response to any actor overlapping with this particular actor, our BP item. Now to overlap with BP item, we're talking about overlapping with any of the components as long as the components are properly configured to respond to those overlap events. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our item mesh, and in the collision section, we're going to take a look at the collision presets. Now this item mesh is set to block all dynamic, one of these pre-built presets, where everything is grayed out. And we'll see that block all dynamic has collision enabled set to both query and physics. Its object type is world dynamic, and the collision responses to all of the other object types is block. Now with these presets, we would expect to not be able to pass through this item. And we can test that theory by taking a BP item and dragging it into the world and pressing play and trying to run through it. And we'll see that indeed we are blocked. So that's as we expect, right? But if we want to generate overlap events, this component has to be configured to overlap with other things. Particularly, I'm interested in overlapping with the pawn collision object type, which is the collision object type of our capsule. We can go back to /character and click the capsule and go down to collision and see that its collision presets is the pawn preset, which has collision enabled query and physics, and its object type is pawn. And we see that by default, it's set to block most other things except for visibility, which is one of the trace responses. That's what we traced against with our sphere trace in the control rig, but it is set to block the camera and basically everything else. Now that's okay if this is set to block everything else. Our BP item has this item mesh and its object type is world dynamic. So the pawn is set to block this, but what happens if we set this item mesh to overlap with the pawn? Well, we can do that by setting collision presets to custom. And in collision responses, for the pawn, we can check overlap. Now we know that collision enabled is query and physics, so spatial queries are possible, and spatial queries include overlaps. And generate overlap events is set to true, so let's see what happens when we try to use this event, actor begin overlap. Now this will trigger when anything overlaps with any component on this actor. We can use a print string node to see how this works. So we'll get a print string and we'll change the end string to overlapped an actor. We'll compile and press play and overlap. And there's that message, overlapped an actor. It happens because our pawn is overlapping with this pyramid static mesh component. Now this happens with any component on BP item. We could add another static mesh. Let's do that. And this second static mesh, I'm going to drag it off to the side. And we can add a shape to this. So we'll go to the static mesh variable and set its value. And I'm going to search for sphere and choose shape sphere. This is included in the project because we have starter content. Now with shape sphere selected, let's go down to collision and change it from block all dynamic to custom. And now we can make sure that our sphere has its collision response to the pawn object type set to overlap. We'll go ahead and check that. Now let's compile and play test this. And this time we'll overlap with the sphere. And as expected, we get that print string because the overlap event was triggered. So this event is kind of general. It triggers when anything overlaps with any of the components on this actor. I'm going to go ahead and delete that second static mesh, and now we just have the pyramid. Now what happens if we'd like to overlap not with the mesh itself, but perhaps the general area around the mesh? Let's say the item mesh is smaller. We can scale it down. We'll set its scale to, say, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. Now it's a very small pyramid, but what if we still want overlap events when we get close? Well, Unreal Engine has a number of classes derived from the scene component class designed to do this. Let's click Add and type Sphere and choose Sphere Collision. And notice we have this sphere, and it has a sphere radius property, and we can click and drag that to increase it. We can set its value directly as well, say to 80. And now we have this sphere, which we can see in the world. And let's say we'd like to overlap with the sphere itself. Now we could use actor begin overlap. In fact, sphere by default has its collision settings set up a little differently. Its collision presets is set to overlap all dynamic. Notice it has query only, so no physics for the sphere component, but spatial queries are enabled, and it's set to overlap all other object types. So we can go ahead and overlap with the sphere, and we will get our overlapped an actor print string. So that's great, but we may wish to only overlap with the sphere component itself. For example, we may have the sphere component off to the side here, and we may not want our overlap event triggered when we overlap with the pyramid. We can test this out pretty easily by showing our sphere in game. With our sphere selected, we can search for hidden in game and uncheck that. This way, if we press play, we'll actually see that sphere in the game. Now, if we overlap with the actual pyramid, we still get that overlap event generated, and we're printing the string. But let's say we only want that event generated when we overlap with the sphere itself and not the pyramid. Well, this event actor begin overlap is not the only event that exists in Unreal Engine. We can have overlap events for individual components themselves. So with our sphere selected, we can right-click in the event graph and type on component begin overlap. This is similar to actor begin overlap, but notice it has a lot more information, and on component begin overlap has parentheses sphere in the name. This means that the event will be triggered in response to an overlap with the sphere component specifically. Let's use print string here, and we'll print the message overlapped with the sphere. Now we can hit play, and if we overlap with the pyramid, nothing happens. But if we overlap with the sphere itself, we get our message printed to the screen. So on component begin overlap lets us have a bit more control over the overlap events. We can control exactly which component triggers some sort of response. So generally, this is the overlap event we prefer to use as developers, as it gives us more control and it allows us to specify that our component, the sphere in this case, is what generates the overlap event and not the actor itself. So this is great for picking up, say, pickups in the world that will be destroyed once we actually pick them up, and we can increase some sort of stat on the character class. And notice we have these inputs that give us information. We have overlapped component, which tells us which component on this actor is being overlapped. We can drag off of this, and the overlapped component has an inherited function called getObjectName. This returns a string, and we can use a print string node, passing in that string to see which component was overlapped. Let's go ahead and overlap, and we see sphere printed to the screen. So that's what overlap component is. But what about other actor? Well, that's the actor overlapping with our BP item. And actors also have getObjectName. So we can use other actor to print the name of the actor overlapping. If we go ahead and overlap, we see BP/character with some extra characters tagged onto the end of that name, as Unreal Engine will sometimes append to the end of names to keep track of things. We also have other comp, which is the component doing the overlapping here on the other actor. If we press play and overlap, we see collision cylinder. That's the capsule component on /character. Notice we have this collision cylinder in parentheses. That's the internal name. Remember the text macro when creating default subobjects? We're specifying an internal name. Now we're getting to see that internal name, which is returned by that node getObjectName. Now we have a number of other inputs, but we're just going to talk about these for now. And in the next video, we'll look into how to implement this from the C++ side by discussing how Unreal Engine's delegate system works. So we'll talk about what delegates are in the next video. I'll see you soon.